You're listening to Heritage Radio Network. HRN is food radio supported by you. Learn more at heritageradionetwork.org. This episode of Pizza Quest is brought to you by Central Milling, hand-selected grain, expertly milled for passionate bakers. Central Milling is the farmer, the miller, and the baker working together to preserve American farmland for tomorrow while providing the highest quality flour and grains for the bakers of today. Dating back over 150 years, Central Milling is built on generations of knowledge, and they know that premium flour starts at the source. Employee-owned, Central Milling works directly with their farmers to sustainably grow grains that have exceptional flavor, nutrient content, color, and baking performance, which results in one of the largest selections of premium specialty flour and grains in the country. Hand-selected for the highest baking qualities, milled, cracked, or blended slowly to minimize heat generation, then bake-tested for performance. Learn more about Central Milling and their products at centralmilling.com. Hi, I'm Peter Reinhardt, and welcome to Pizza Quest. We're here today with an old and dear friend of mine. Well, when I say old, I mean, yeah, you're getting a little older too, but I mean, we've been friends for a long, long time. This is John Ash, Chef John Ash, who many of us from the wine country area in the Bay Area know as kind of the godfather of wine country cuisine. John Ash's restaurant, John Ash and Company, was probably the first fine dining restaurant that my wife and I ever went to together and had one of the most memorable meals of our lives. And the other thing that John was so important in my life is that when I had my bakery a few miles from his restaurant, he was the first chef to actually ask if we would make bread for his restaurant, which put us on the map because he was much more known than we were at that time. And suddenly people took us seriously because John Ash was using our bread. And ever since then, we've been friends and stayed in touch with each other even after Susan and I moved east. And John is also, just way of quick background, the co-host of what may be the longest running food radio show in the country. Is it still not, John, the longest running?
It is.
For a while, there was something on the East Coast that was started before you, but I don't even think they're still around, right?
No, they're not. They've all gone away. We've checked.
So John and Steve Garner have been doing the Good Food Hour for 38 years, is it now?
Yeah.
It's hard to believe. I mean, and I remember when it was just first coming on the air, so that dates me as well. I can't believe it. So much time has flown by, but a lot has happened since. In addition to John Ash and Company, John was the culinary director at the Fetzer Winery and Vineyards and ran this wonderful program, a food and wine program there that used to bring in some great chefs. I got to go to a number of events you did. I worked in the back kitchen and washed dishes for Julia Child. That was one of my favorite memories, and many other adventures that we've had together over the years. And also, John has written a number of books, and I'm just going to quickly cite them because we'll refer to these in a minute. But the book that kind of established your literary, cred was From the Earth to the Table, which won the IACP Cookbook of the Year. And I was there the night that the book won that award. I don't even think you were there to receive it that night, but I was, but it did win. And it was not just the category winner, but the book of the year. And we remember when you were writing it because we were living just a couple of miles from you when you were putting that book together. Since then, also a book called Culinary Birds, right, which is all about cooking all different kinds of birds, but also another book on wild game, right? Didn't you do a book on wild game?
Well, I did. My very first book was called American Game Cooking.
Game cooking, yeah. So that was even before From the Earth to the Table, and then and now the new one. And this is, and we'll spend most of today's conversation on the new book. This is the Hog Island book of fish and seafood by John Ash. So we're going to want to find out a little bit about Hog Island and how this book came to be. It's a gorgeous book. I'm in love with it. There's phenomenal photos, pictures, knowledge about cooking every kind of seafood, and even includes a recipe that you asked from my previous book to put in here, which is a clam pizza, which fit nicely with your theme. So thank you for including that in this book. And I want to hear all about how this book sort of evolved and came to be, and where all these, I don't know, hundreds of recipes came from. But for the sake of our viewers and listeners who don't know you, maybe never lived in the wine country and never, ran across you in all the many seminars and classes and things that you've done, can you kind of catch us up a little bit on your background? How did you end up becoming a chef? Because you didn't start out as a chef, but by the time I met you, you were already the celebrated chef of our area. But how did it all start for you?
Well, it's like most of us. It starts in ways that you never imagine it's going to go. For me, I graduated from college as an undergraduate in fine arts as a painter. And somewhere along the line, I won't go into all the bloody details of it, somewhere along the line, I found out that everything I ever wanted to do with paint on a canvas, I could do with food on a plate. Plus, if that weren't enough, you got to eat it, which was great.
Yeah.
And bad food, unlike bad paintings, bad food just goes away. Bad paintings, my mom, until she passed away, had all these god-awful paintings that I had done. And I kept saying to her, would you please get rid of those, destroy those? But they continued to hang around. And so
they don't have as much of a half-life as a dish that is ready to go into the garbage disposal.
That's right. If it doesn't work, it's okay. You don't think about it. Anyway, so over the years, I worked for a number of, kind of gradually, people ask me, well, which you just did, how did you get into it? I worked for a number of years for Del Monte Foods in San Francisco, developing new food products, which was kind of thing. Del Monte was a big, slow-moving company, but I learned a lot about big food, which was fascinating to me. And then eventually,
did you find before you move on to that, did you find that a number of other chefs kind of did some time working for major food companies and kind of learned that aspect of the business as opposed to just jumping into a fine dining kitchen?
Not so much. More went to the CIA or did something like that to start their careers or work for somebody.
So that gave you a unique perspective then on sort of how food is produced for mass consumption.
Yeah. The traditional way for most chefs was to follow the French tradition, which was to go work for somebody that you admired and then work for nothing but work hard and learn all that you could and then go to another one and all of that kind of business. So this was kind of a different deal. Anyway,
But while you were there, did you get to produce any, work on any
I did.
Del Monte dishes?
So can I share with you? If I had a nickel for every one of these that were sold, I would be living, I don't know where I'd be living, but it's very glamorous right now. I helped develop, I'm really dating myself now, a product called pudding cups, which little aseptically canned.
I've eaten many of them as a kid.
No, they were great. They were fantastic.
Are they still being produced?
They are still being produced, but not like they used to be.
Yeah.
But yeah, they still are. The fascinating thing about them is that it was one of those things that, and this was the fun part of working for Del Monte, was that we were given tasks or given opportunities to develop things, not so much from a culinary standpoint, but from the standpoint of how can we make this work? And so the Del Monte guys in the Midwest had discovered that there was this huge amount of what was called grade B milk. It didn't mean it was bad. It just didn't meet the butterfat requirements and all this stuff that we could have for nothing.
Oh my gosh.
And so that's what started the pudding cups thing. I thought, well, we can do something with that milk. And there you go.
Well, good thing is people love pudding.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Anyway, that was that. And then I sort of, wanted to do more culinarily. and so ended up going to France, which was the traditional route then at that time, and worked for a couple of great chefs as a doing stages, they're called,
Yes.
working for nothing.
Right. Paying your dues.
And I mean, they give you a place to live, not a very nice place to live, but it was a great learning experience. And then when I came back to Sonoma County, as you can attest to, I had spent most of my time in Burgundy. Sonoma County was so much like Burgundy in terms of the topography and all of that I said, this is where I want to be. And so that was how it started.
So you, from France, you came back and ended up in Sonoma County.
Yes.
You weren't there before you went on this journey to France.
No.
So you were drawn to the wine country of the United States then,
because
American Burgundy.
Because it was somebody from the New York Times, she didn't get it quite right, but she described Sonoma County as America's Provence.
Yeah.
I think it was more America's Burgundy, but it was that because it was rich in producers of all kinds of things, that most of which got shipped other places, got shipped to LA or got shipped to New York or something like that. But we had great cheese makers and olive oil makers, and the usual.
Well, that was what was so amazing,
and all of that, and so it seems such a shame to me that here we had all this wonderful stuff being produced locally that wasn't being consumed locally. So I opened the first John Ash and Company, and that was, as they say, that's the story.
No, really got it going, and in a sense, you were right that Sonoma County, being that it's a coastal, plus it kind of goes right up to a small little mountain range that separates it from Napa. So Sonoma and Napa are the two great wine regions of the United States. Yeah. So here you are living and I think Sonoma's wines, personally, I think they're better than the Napa wines. I love them.
There are many more of them that people don't realize that always. I think Napa's done a very good job of promoting Napa. That was really Robert Mondavi who did that.
Yes. Napa was definitely better promotion than Sonoma County has been.
Yeah.
But in terms of diversity, what was great about it for all of us was how many different things you can get from the coastal seafood and of course oysters, which will bring us to the new book. But remember that for a number of years when I lived there, and we would be part of a group that would put on an annual event, sort of a farm to table event featuring all of the foods of Sonoma County in one place, and people would buy tickets for it, and there was no end of things that you could do pretty much anything with the food there. So was that kind of like the inspiration for John Ash and Company, was to showcase the ingredients and foods of that area
and wines? And so part of the other thing that we did, which is hard to imagine now, but we were the first really to take on matching food and wine together, making suggestions about wines that might go with particular dishes that we created. And that was, I mean, Americans back then, this was back in the late 70s, Americans then were pretty wine unsavvy.
Yes.
They I think we had Gallo Hardy Burgundy or something like that.
Most people knew Thunderbird, but no. but yeah, you're right, because we just always deferred to France or Europe's wine and didn't realize that we had this phenomenal wine region here. But it was just coming alive then, and just like the whole culinary scene was coming alive.
The thing that really helped was, and I think many people can remember that, was the great Paris tasting of 1976, in which American wineries beat the best of the French Bordeaux, Burgundy, and all of that stuff. And the French were just outraged.
They couldn't believe it.
Who are these people? They don't know anything about making wine and all that stuff.
Didn't they make a movie about that too?
They did. It was called. What was it called?
Was it Uncorked or? It was one of the great wine movies that came out 20 years ago.
It was.
Well, in the bread world, a similar thing happened when Craig Ponsford, also a local baker. He had a
Yeah,
bakery in
yeah,
Sonoma County, right in the town of Sonoma. Won the World Baguette Championship at the Coupe du Monde in 1995 or so, 95, 96. And the French couldn't believe it. They had never lost the Coupe du Monde.
yeah,
And here are some Americans. So suddenly America's on the stage. Our
yeah.
wines, our foods, our cheeses. A lot of our cheeses have gone on to win gold medals at the international competitions. Many of them coming from the cheese producers of Sonoma County.
Yes, yeah. One of the great trips here, which I know you're very familiar with, but and now it's developed in other parts of the country, actually in your part of the world too, but is the cheese trail in California. So like the wine trail, when it started, there are now, you can get a map and go visit 20, 30 different cheesemakers making different kinds of cheeses and all that stuff. And it's such a treat.
Wow. Well, we had a show recently with where we talked about bourbon, and there's a bourbon trail now too.
Yes, yeah.
Down here in the Kentucky area, and so, but that's what's been, I think, wonderful for all of us who are in the culinary world to be able to be part of, is watching these various subcultures kind of emerge. Many of them related to fermentation.
Yeah,
It's cheese, wine, beer, but everywhere popping up. To somehow the American food scene seems to have vaulted, to the front of the class.
yeah, yeah. It's fascinating, and what it does is that it moves the whole understanding of what great food is about and how it's made and all of that. It really helps people understand the process and really develop an appreciation for it. The local one now that is really on fire is chocolate, which is another fermented product.
Sounds good to me. Yeah, chocolate is.
Yeah.
If the supply can sustain itself. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and then again, are there some great chocolatiers in the area?
Yes. Yeah. They're more every day. It seems like it's the hot new thing. I don't know what the hot new thing is anymore.
Well, that's the thing, is that when I moved back to the East Coast, I used to predict for the locals here what was going to be the next food trend, and they say, "Well, how do you know this?" And I say, "Well, because I came from Sonoma County, which is like 10 years ahead of where everybody else is, and I saw it happen there first, and so it's inevitable."
Yeah.
And so many things did start, but you took then your. Let me take one step back. You went to France to do some stages and kind of apprentice yourself to some of the great chefs there. What did you learn in France that not only that you didn't know before, but that you were then able to apply when you came back and landed in Sonoma?
Well, again, it seems silly now because we overuse this term, farm to table and all that stuff. But that I think that was what I learned, because that certainly wasn't the way things were being done here. You called up, typically if you're a restaurateur or chef, you called up your local wholesaler and got some 6x6 tomatoes, which had nothing to do with flavor or any of that stuff, but only with size. And that was the way things were being done. And I think for those of us who went and spent time in France, it was that living and that's what Sonoma County was for me and for you too, living very close to people who were producing the products, and we became very intimate with them.
Yes.
And really learned as much from them as they may have learned from us.
Yeah, it was a great sort of community of producers and friends and collaborators. But and also at that time, now you're referring back to like the late 70s or so. That was when Alice Waters was emerging with Chez Panisse and Jeremiah Tower, and there were a lot of Bay Area chefs who were becoming celebrity chefs, so to speak. It helped to launch what's known as sort of the new American culinary renaissance, and you were part of that community. Did you guys know each other and collaborate and share ideas?
Yeah, we did. We were all pretty busy running our businesses, but for these things, the thing that you mentioned, for example, of getting together with to do special events and things like that, we would come together for those, and that was a chance to talk and share ideas and do all of that stuff. And there were some characters in there, but there were a number beyond the, I certainly admire Alice Waters. I'm going to say to you, this is probably heretical. Alice takes credit for a lot of stuff that she didn't do. She was not the person who started the whole farm to table movement. That was started many centuries before in France and in other
Yeah.
parts of Europe and all of that stuff. But she's very smart.
And she applied it. She did.
But she did.
Yeah.
She applied it and was smart enough to publicize it. To
That's
get
right. She branded it.
yeah, but she wasn't the first for sure.
But you get credit for coming up with that title, from the earth to the table, which was a very poetic title at the time that the book came out. But now it's like every chef in the world is saying, "Yeah, I'm farm to table, I'm farm to fork," and all these other terms that have come that are relatively new, but they didn't exist before.
No, they didn't.
The others started that.
And I think you can talk about this too. That there are a lot of people who use that description, farm to table, whatever it is today, who really aren't farm to table. So I think sometimes you have to ask a question, which is a kind of backhanded way of leading into this new book that I did about seafood. Seafood it's of course is fantastic and all of that stuff, but it's one of the most it's an area in which there's more misinformation, mislabeling, misbranding, and stuff that goes on because we're not out on the sea, typically all of us. That it's a little crazy. So you have to be very careful about what you buy and who you get it from and what they're.
Well, maybe let's explore that a little bit as we talk about the new book, the Hog Island Book of Fish and Seafood. So Hog Island is, got their name at the top of it. Can you explain for the few people out there who don't know what a Hog Island is, what Hog Island, I call them the Hog Island Oyster Farm, but maybe they're way more than that now.
Well, they've become more than that, but they were, it really started with two guys who grew up on the East Coast and came west and started an oyster farm. And I was one of their first, Alice Waters and I and Jeremiah Tower and Judy Rogers was really an important contributor to their fame. We started buying oysters from them. And again, this is one of those kind of funny things, but back in the late 70s, oysters were not very important to most Americans unless you lived in a coastal area and had some familiarity with it. But it was not something you found in most restaurant situations. So we started, and it was kind of a slow start, but buying oysters from Hog Island. And Hog Island has since become this kind of legendary farmers of oysters on Tomales Bay.
Yes,
the little town of Marshall, and it's grown to the point where it has now 6 oyster bars and all of that stuff spread.
Yeah, I've been to the oyster bar in San Francisco at the ferry terminal building. Yeah. Wonderful restaurant there.
Yeah,
and
that was the first restaurant. Up until that point, and I was part of it. I was on the board of directors for a number of years. And we never made any money. We farmed oysters very well, but there was never just quite enough money made to do much expansion. And then we opened the Hog Island Oyster Bar at Ferry Plaza in San Francisco in the Ferry Building, and that changed everything. We became restaurateurs.
You're right, and generated some revenue streams.
And finally generated some because before then, the only reason that you became part of Hog Island, joined at all to be part of the board or do any of those kinds of things, was that twice a year they had these big blowout oyster fests at the farm. And you could go and eat as many oysters as you could possibly eat. You never got paid for anything, but you did get a lot of oysters.
Were the oysters that were coming from the bay, and that's right on the coast, near Point Reyes National Park,
Yeah,
and it's a
yeah,
beautiful area. And that,
yeah.
just fabulous area. Was there something special about those oysters that differentiated them from oysters that were coming from Washington State or from East Coast oysters and things like
Well,
that?
it's interesting, and I talk about it a lot in the book, and I won't go into it deeply here. But oysters are they're basically all of certainly the West Coast oysters. It's all the same oyster. It's all the same species. It changes. The reason that it changes in terms of flavor and texture and all of
Yeah.
that is the place that it is grown. It
Oh,
more than any other thing that I can think of in the world really reflects the place that it is grown. So to grow it, an oyster, we grew them in Tomales Bay. But if you went up the coast up to Oregon and Washington and places like that, the same same oyster, it would look different. It would have different flavor. It would have all of those things.
yeah. It
Again,
seemed like there was like the Kumamotos and there's the Olympias and all these things. But you're saying they basically the same oyster, they just grow differently
yeah,
depending on this quote soil that they're growing.
exactly. Well, it's the same thing that I don't know whether they talk about it in your part of the world, but I know I have a good friend in New Jersey who tells me that California tomatoes,
Yeah.
they're nothing compared
The
to
folks in Jersey are very proud of their Jersey
yeah,
tomatoes,
yeah,
absolutely, and they are great.
and peaches in Georgia and things like that.
Right. Well, the same thing with tomatoes in California and in San Marzano.
Yeah.
It's the same tomato, right? It's the same essentially species, just growing in the local soil.
But
So
it's different when you get the ones from Italy grown on the slopes of Mount Etna. That it has a whole different flavor and texture.
yeah, they get that volcanic ash.
Yes, exactly. Than those
So,
in California.
so this is something people don't think about that often with seafood is how critical the area that it's happened, where they were cultivated, where they grew, and
Yeah,
how that affects flavor.
yeah.
So did the flavor of the Tomales Bay oysters, which Hog Island was one. I know there were a couple other oyster farms at the time. Maybe, as you said, it's such a tough business. Most of them are not in existence
No,
anymore.
no.
I remember our friends Jorge and Lisa had a oyster farm just up the road from them, and we used to, have oysters with them all the time. And they had to get out of the business because they just couldn't make a living at it.
Yeah,
But the oysters themselves were great. But is there something distinctive about the flavor that you would?
so the answer is yes. And you have to try them side by side to understand what that difference is. The Hog Islands, and Hog Island was the name. Actually, there's a little island in Tomales Bay called Hog Island, and that was where the farm took its name from. They just have they're brighter. There are all kinds of culinary terms you can use to describe it. But when you try them side by side, even from an oyster grown a mile down the road, you can taste the difference.
Really? Now, and some of the terms that I hear associated with oysters are briny, or sweet. How would you define these? Because we don't have an oyster tasting chart.
No,
maybe is there one yet? Maybe there should be one
there should be one. Yeah, that's a good idea.
There was no wine tasting chart either until I think around 1995 or so, and then somebody came up with the idea of doing that.
A flavor chart, and actually there is, if you dig, I mean, you know about this, but if you dig deeply into it, there are flavor charts, flavor profile charts for all kinds of things, for coffee, for beer, for whiskey, for all of that, which define the different attributes that you can have in these things. And every one of them, every one that you might try won't have all of them, but it'll be distinctive in something that comes through.
Right.
So Tomales Bay was really about they coined the word Sweetwater, Hog Island Sweetwaters.
Oh, okay.
And because they had, as opposed to some of the East Coast oysters, which were really briny and salty, these were less that way and had more of an oyster flavor to them, which I think helped in their success.
Interesting. And then I associate also the names of certain oysters with the size of the oysters. So the Hog Island oysters I always thought of as sort of medium size or average size, and then there was one that was like there's a type of oyster that was smaller, and then weren't the Olympia oysters the ones that were like gigantic?
No, the Olympias are quite the opposite. They're the
They're the
smallest
okay.
of all of those.
Well, then
And
there's some
Olympias are a different. The classic oyster grown on the West Coast and now grown in much of the United States is the Japanese oyster called the Miyagi. And so that's the one that will take on the characteristics of the place that is grown. Olympia oysters were the true American oyster. They're very tiny. They are grown and only exist or primarily exist around the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State. And they're expensive because they're so tiny, and they're also they're not very prolific. They take an extra year or two to grow.
Wow.
When you get them, it's really we'll have some when you come out.
But it's got to be a tricky business to operate. If it costs more to grow them, they're smaller, and there's not that many of them.
Yeah.
How does anybody make a living growing oysters?
That's it.
Now I always thought that oysters originated like in the Chesapeake Bay area. That's where I think of as an East Coast guy that the Chesapeake was known for its oysters. And is that a different oyster then? It all comes from the same.
It basically is a different oyster, a different species. The other name that's often applied to them is blue points, which you've heard. But we also got oysters, and again, somewhat different species from the Gulf of Mexico. New Orleans, of course, is famous for oysters. Places, Florida, Apalachicola, and places like that, which take on the name. Typically, oysters take on the name of the place that they're from. Although not always, but that was the idea with Apalachicola because that's the town in Florida.
I see. Yeah, because I know they have a very distinct sort of style of oyster down.
They tend to be bigger. When you talk about size, the ones that we grow for half shell eating are actually very small. They're classified as extra small because the bigger they get, the fleshier they get, and typically those are used for grilling or baking or something like that. Because they have more of a fleshy character to them. But the ones you want to eat on the half shell, and this was a tradition from France, was to get the tiny ones that you could kind of pop out, and they were sort of sweet and delicate.
Well, I was going to ask you, from a flavor standpoint, does size matter? Is smaller better than larger?
Yes, it does. You get more money for them. And you don't have to grow them as long, so you don't have to.
That's interesting. And then the kind of oysters you see in oyster stews, they're usually the big ones. The bigger ones, they'll be called mediums. And you can buy oysters outside of the shell. You can buy them shucked already in jars, refrigerated, and often those are the ones that are used in oyster stew and fried oysters and things like that. And frankly, if you like oysters, they're all good, no matter what kind you get.
Absolutely.
And if you love them, you never can get enough of them. And of course, there's legendary things about the properties of oysters as aphrodisiacs and everything else that add to the mythos of oysters.
Yeah, I don't know if that's really true, but it's worth a try.
I think MFK Fisher wrote about that at one time. But I think she also wrote about that she ate so many, to try to get in the mood that she got really sick and she lost the mood.
It was a great little book that, and for those who don't know MFK Fisher, she's one of the great writers about food in the world, and she wrote a little book called "Consider the Oyster."
Yes, a classic. Yes. And fortunately for me, that we both had the rare opportunity to have a meal with MFK Fisher before she passed away, because she lived also in Sonoma County at the end of her life, not far from where your restaurant was.
In Glen Ellen. I was lucky enough. I kind of had my Tuesdays at Maury's kinds of experiences with MFK, and I would go at least once a month to have lunch with her, just she and I. And we would talk about everything, not just about food, but she was one of the most brilliant people in the world, and was a real, excuse me, leader in things like use of pesticides and railing against that, and things that were used in agriculture generally. So
yeah, she was so influential, such an influencer, if you want to use a current term. She was the influencer of all the food writers and many chefs that followed after her. And
isn't it sad? I'll ask you, isn't it sad? I think with your students and stuff, and mine too, I'll ask them, I'll say, okay, raise your hand. How many of you have ever heard of MFK Fisher? And very few now have heard of it. And it's really a shame, because she was.
That's true. And how quickly people forget this. And this current generation of culinary students has no history, sort of, what we call the basketball players. We see the same thing in sports. They only know what they learn in the playgrounds. They don't know the history of the sport. So now in the culinary schools, the good ones, at least we go back and teach them that, and we require them to read MFK Fisher and to read, obviously, to go back to the great chefs like Escoffier, but also the great chefs that were part of the lineage that they're part of now. And because they don't know 30 years ago, they don't know who Paul Bocuse was, or they don't know, it's amazing to me how many people don't even know who Alice Waters is. Because she was the most high profile of all the, we'll call it, California chefs. And some of us who knew her are shocked that someone doesn't know who she is. But it's our job to kind of pass it along.
It's interesting how in the world, in the culinary world right now, we're off onto a part you mentioned earlier. I do this radio show, and we get a lot of authors on the radio show to talk about. And it's been interesting over, especially the past few years, that the authors who are appearing are those that are doing very specific and mysterious cuisines. We're learning about things that we never knew about before, the cuisines of the Middle East and that kind of stuff that we had no idea how to
right. The so-called exotic foods and things. Well, this new book it's more than just about oysters, although I could talk all day with you about oysters. I love it so much. But this is called Fish and Seafood, the Hog Island book. So you partnered up with Hog Island Farm to create this book, and it's loaded with recipes. Where did all these recipes come from? And did you develop all these, or they?
No, I didn't. Some came from friends of Hog Island, people who over the years had supported Hog Island, had bought oysters from them, and all of that stuff. Some came from the Hog Island oyster bar chefs themselves.
Oh, that's
recipes. And again, not just oysters, but the whole broad range of things. And kind of what happened, the reason that Hog Island started doing more than oysters was really a function of the pandemic. When the pandemic came, suddenly sales of oysters dried up, and also, as you will recall, people didn't go out as much and all of that kind of stuff. And so it was important for Hog Island to find another way to stay in business. And one of those was that over the years, they had all kinds of friends, fishermen friends. And so we started selling direct to consumer fresh fishes, mostly from the West Coast, but some from the East Coast, but primarily West Coast fishes, because those were the freshest and closest to us. And that started us down the road of getting very involved with fin fishes as well as shellfishes of all kinds.
I see. So it really expanded out. Well, before we run out of time, maybe after all the research that you did to put this book together, what are some of the key takeaways that anybody who's sort of entering into the world of fish, who just only knows very little, has not been trained, should know about fish? What are some myths or facts that are critical for moving forward to have a greater appreciation?
That's a great question. I think one of them is to know, and this is true whether you're a professional or just an amateur and you're doing, is to know your purveyor, to know who's selling the fish to you. Because unfortunately, seafood, as I mentioned in the very beginning, is the most mislabeled product in the world. It's
Right.
even worse than olive oil. Uh, it things are mislabeled. They're not always handled in the best of ways. So it's important to understand what's the best way to handle. How do we make sure that they are as good as they can possibly be? One of the myths to dispel is frozen versus fresh.
I was going to ask you about that. Yeah, I learned something when I read the book, that you can actually take a frozen fish and cook it right from the freezer.
You can do that, and typically, and we've done this many times, taken something frozen, often because they're often now frozen right on the boat, cleaned and frozen. Take that fish and cook it next to a fresh one that maybe has been out of the water for a few hours, and the frozen one will be better. It'll
kind of like when the Americans beat the French in wine.
Exactly. So that idea that fresh is always better is a myth that you can kind of put away.
So this is, I guess, something not everybody knows. Maybe many people do. That most fish, when it's caught, is flash frozen right there, or deep, quick frozen.
A lot of it is depending upon the fish, but then there's a lot of it that hangs around. And one of the, certain fishes and shellfishes really suffer as a result of spending any time outside the water. So again, it's knowing who you're buying your fish from. You probably just don't go into a supermarket and buy fresh fish or fresh shellfish.
It's not always how much you know, it's who you know that can help educate you, like your fish.
And what the pathway has been to get it there. And again, there are a lot of there still is. It's I don't want to create any problems, but it's an area. Fishermen they're kind of independent contractors. They do whatever they want to do, and they'll tell you anything they want to tell you. So that's why it's important to get somebody who's really reputable.
Interesting. So great tip. Find somebody if you're going to buy fish, whether fresh, frozen. Find somebody who's selling it, who you trust, and it's done the work.
And almost always now. And one of the things that's so fantastic is that the direct to consumer, there are all kinds of sources now online for buying fish. Like I buy Alaska salmon and halibut and all of that stuff directly, flash frozen on the boat. It's as good as anything, if not better, again, than anything I might get fresh. But it's true of other fishes that that are not available to me in California. Hawaiian fish, which again are frozen, shipped immediately here. Things like what you get on the East Coast, which we don't get, are great scallops and lobster and stuff like that.
Interesting.
The only way you can get them is to buy them direct from the fisherman who has processed them.
And through the magic of freezing
it's been a boon for us all. So if you're interested, you can go online and start looking for one. Can I mention a couple that I have nothing to do with them other than I buy their
I think
products.
It'd be great I think we'd love to hear what tips.
One is up in Maine called Wolf, WULF. I can't spell it.
ULF. Okay.
Is just go online and look for Wolf Seafood. They're and they bring in fish from all parts of the world, but I've gotten things from them that I never knew existed, that came from New Zealand or came from places like that. Again, that were properly handled, and they have all the protocols in place to make sure that they're really good.
So they aggregate all the types. It's not just one particular type, but they do it right.
Yes, yeah. Plus, I'm a great lover of caviar, and they're great caviar producers.
Interesting. Okay. Any other companies that you want to shout out?
Oh, there's in Alaska, there are a couple. There's Great Alaska Seafood is a great one, and they focus just on fishes and shellfishes from Alaska, but they're pristine and beautiful and all of that stuff. And actually, often they end up being less expensive than what you buy at a fish market, and you have the assurance that they've been properly handled.
Interesting. we'll be having a show in the future with a friend of mine's involved in a new company called Forever Oceans, where they're doing ocean raised, but ocean farm raised yellowtail. And that's a problematic fish, as they explained it to me, and we'll talk about that in their show, because the wild yellowtail are often full of parasites. When they can do it in a controlled environment, and they'll be selling both directly to restaurants and to consumers. Again, they farm it, freeze it immediately, and that's a whole species that it's very expensive. Normally, they by able to control the amount that they can farm, they can bring the prices down.
It's true. One of the I talk in the book about sushi, and people go, "Oh, well, you get absolutely fresh fish and you fillet it and cut it up and all this stuff." And no, you don't. By law, all fish that's used for sushi in restaurant situations must be hard frozen, and there are very specific times and temperatures at which it must be done to do that. So,
does that kill the parasites? Is that why you freeze it?
Yes, kills the parasites that are.
So that's one way to get it to know it's safe to eat. So that's another question, maybe another one of those questions that come up all the time is how safe is it to eat sushi? Yeah. And are there any other caveats that we should know about before we lose you today? We have access to your knowledge, things that we should know about to make sure that we're doing it safely.
Well, I think the most important thing is to be able to trust the person who's selling it to you, and depend upon them to do the hard work of making sure that it's as clean and as good as it can possibly be. Okay, great. And any other particular species of fish that you think we should be aware of and know about, that maybe the next thing that few people know about but ought to know about? Okay, so here's my favorite fish. If I had to eat one fish for the rest of my life, and that's hard because I love so many of them. Yeah. But it is a fish that goes by several different names. It goes by the name black cod. It goes by black cod. It goes by the name sable fish, and it also goes by the name butterfish. It's all the same fish, but it's a West Coast, goes from Northern California up to Alaska fish. It is the most delicious fish in the world. Its name butterfish really maybe best describes it, because it's a really oily fish, but not in a bad way. Yeah. It's a fish you can't overcook. Even if you overcook it and it falls apart, it still tastes good. It's still moist and delicious. That's a great tip to leave on today, because unfortunately we're running out of time. But John, I love the book. I'm going to hold up for those people who are watching us on the video cast, my favorite picture, which is your picture of my pizza. The Clams Casino pizza is better than the photo that we got in my book for it. I love this photo. If I'd want to make this pizza too. You know what's so interesting about it? When you sent me that recipe, I said, this can't work, because the clams are going to open up and the pizza crust is going to be soggy and all of that stuff. But it works wonderfully. And you can't beat clams and bacon. And bacon, right? Well, John Ash, thank you so much for being with us today. It's been great to see you again. And I'm looking forward to seeing you when I'm out in Sonoma County again, in Santa Rosa, our shared hometown for a long time. And congratulations on the new book. This book is so beautiful that I expect to see it pop up again at award season. And it won't be your first James Beard Award for a book. So, keep doing them. And again, thank you so much for sharing your expertise, your time, your passion, and phenomenal food. Your restaurant made a big difference in my life and my wife's life for many reasons. Yeah. It's still there. So John Ash and Company in it's like right on the Russian River area, right? Sonoma County. So I'll look forward. Maybe we stop by for lunch when we're out there. Of course. All right, John. Thank you. Congratulations. Thank all of you for viewing and listening today to Pizza Quest, and we'll see you at the next episode.
Pizza Quest is powered by Simplecast. Thanks for listening to Heritage Radio Network, food radio supported by you. Keep in touch at heritageradionetwork.org/subscribe.